Okay, I'll say just a word about the source, a word about some of the circumstances, and then I would like us to pick out some things from the text itself. First of all, a word about the sources that we're all considering here today. I look and I see so many Pinkasim, Pinkasei Kehila, various other documents that are written, and it reminded me that we might want to put this into the framework that one of the pioneers in writing about Jewish communal power in the post-Talmudic age, Simcha Asaf, in his book Ha'onshin Achar Chatimat HaTalmud, who argued that collectively, if you take all these sources and consider them, we're dealing with a monumental creative achievement. Jewish life as it was lived through these varied sources is in itself something that we haven't really perhaps given its due as a text worthy of our consideration. And not only official communal records, what I'm looking at is what you might call a semi-official. A Shamash keeps his own records. It's not a personal document. He never records, or virtually never records, his own feelings, his own reactions. This is not his personal diary. It is a communal record. Today, every single entry is dated, Hayom Yom, and he'll tell you the day and the year, and he'll write down what he did in his official capacity as a Shamash, and the first two entries I gave you are probably copied from earlier years' books, discuss his mandate. I was appointed to go and be an emissary from the Rav and from the Kahal to communicate their decisions to the public. So that's his job. And this particular Pinkas is something that the Jewish Theological Seminary had an occasion to buy several manuscripts out of a whole collection. And as I started to read it, I insisted that they buy this one, and they were kind enough to do so, and I want to thank them very much. Second word, just about context. Altona is part of, as you know, a tripartite community. It's a little bit different structure than most individual kehilot. Kehilot Ahu, Altona, Hamburg, Wandsbek had to operate in some respects as three separate communities and in other respects as a united community. And it is that difference from the other kehilot that allowed these cases to come to our attention. They would have never arisen as points of contention had there not been a question of who is responsible for these fatherless children. And we'll look at that. But again, it's the unique structure of these kehilot that even brings these cases to our attention. Some more general remarks. As Elisheva has noted in her book, much of the literature about the Jewish family used to idealize it. We're not talking about Christian Hebraism, but Jewish scholarship. Recent work, in particular, I want to mention the work of Elliot Horowitz, of Howard Edelman, of Jonathan Schorsch, of Yom Tov Assis, but many others are opening up for us the underside, a darker strain, if you will, in Jewish family life without apologetics. This is not to say that violence or exploitation typified Jewish family life. That is not what I am arguing, but it was certainly not absent from pre-modern Jewish society. A family. What distinguishes a family from a household are servants. Domestic servants are part of a household, but not part of the nuclear family. And so they have this kind of liminal status. They're intimate in terms of space, as we know from Adam Teller's work and many others. Space does not abound. especially where Jews are restricted and where they can live and how they can live. Servants all over Europe, not just among Jews, often share the most intimate spaces with the people who employ them. Okay, so let's keep that in mind. We're talking then about households in which servants are integrated, but privacy is not particularly abundant. And finally, a word about Jewish maid servants. In some parts of Europe, Jews employed primarily Christians to serve in their households. It's true in parts of Eastern Europe. It's true in other parts of the world. In Western Europe, a different custom arose. And if you trace back in Pinkas Shamash, it goes all the way back to the late Middle Ages and the rise of importance of dowry, of a woman bringing a dowry, a significant sum of money, into the marriage. What happens to women who are either orphans or very desperately poor, who don't have the resources to bring a dowry? What emerged is the custom of well-to-do relatives or nechbadei kehila as a kind of tzedakah, as an act of charity to the poor, to take a young girl, maybe 11 or 12 years old, into the household, into service. These are not slaves. These are servants who are coming for a pre-agreed number of years, let's say 3 years. At the end of their term of service, they get enough money to provide a poor girl's dowry. That is the ideal here. That is how the system arose. Okay? After a very long time, however, all kinds of abuses come in. Poor parents through the 18th century, if you look at the collections of Yiddish letters, for example, try to place their daughters in good homes, in responsible homes. Sometimes, again, it's distant kin, distant relatives who are known to have been well-to-do and who might look after these girls. So this is the way it was. And that, I think, is the background for what we're going to find in our texts. I began to read through this Pinkas Shamash. As I said in the introduction to the text itself, there are many, many different things here. This is not a major strand or major interest in this Pinkas. Every conceivable issue that comes up in the daily life of a kehillah comes up in his Pinkas. Nevertheless, I was really startled, and I thought I wasn't reading it right when I read the first of the entries, which is number 4A on page 38, and I want to read just one line from the original Hebrew, and then I'll go for the rest of the time to the English. Kan ba'altona nohagin. Im hakala hi zona, az lo kotvin behaktuba lehada betulta, rak lehada stam, and so on and so forth. If the bride is a zona, now this is a strong word, a prostitute, a harlot, then you write a different type of ketubah, not the same one, not the same marriage contract you would write as you would write for a virgin. What? The word zona implied to me a professional streetwalker, but that is not the case. And as you see in the first incident in this particular Pinkas, the entry on page 5a, today I was sent by Reb Chaim, the Parnas HaChodesh, to tell Reb Leib ben Ephraim Heksher that there is here a Yeled Zonah, a child of a harlot from Devorah. And she is a zona, v'hi zona, as she had been a misharetet, umeineket, etzel Yaakov ben Moshe, so on and so forth. So what made her into a zona? She had actually been a misharetet. She had come as a maidservant into somebody's household, and as a result of becoming pregnant, she had then lost her status as a virgin and had become a zona, a harlot. I don't know if there's a better translation. Adam, you look.
They had English word like a loose woman.
Yeah. Okay.
She didn't come as a virgin. She came as a wet nurse. So she was married. She had a relationship with a man before that resulted in a child.
Many of these women went from position to position to position. Yes,
but she's not a virgin here. In any case, she was never a virgin in the first place.
But there, but no. I want to look on.
The Beit Pei in your text could be Beit Pa'amim. It's funny that it's in the middle of the name there, but that might
Ben Pinkas or Ben Much.
It could be anything, but
I don't want to speculate. I want to forge along further because we have limited amount of time, and then I want to open up the floor because there are many things here that are promiscuous. Okay. Well, but see, harlot is because zona is the biblical word, and that's why I chose it. It's a harsh word. In any case, I wanted you to see, if we turn the page to page 39, in the middle of the excerpt from 25b to 26a, look at the third line into that entry where a harlot herself dies. The above-mentioned zona is from the Kehillah of Vansbeck, and the ordinance from our predecessors has been as follows. If her forefathers had been among the members of the Kehillah of Vansbeck, the Kehillah of Vansbeck must pay the burial expenses, not the treasury of the combined three communities. So this is where the conflict arises. In certain cases, it is impossible to determine exactly who is responsible for paying for the expenses either of the woman or of the child that is born to this woman. Now, there are many different cases here, and again, we won't have time to read through all of them. In some cases, the dead child, because it's often the child, and again, children that have no fathers are more likely to be undernourished, underfed. In this case, the child is lingering. I want you to look at page 40, the end of the first paragraph, regarding about 5 lines toward the bottom of that paragraph, regarding the girl who died Saturday night. Do you see that? We must do all we can that she should be brought to burial yet today, for the corpse has been among the non-Jews in a state of true disgrace for 2 days, and she, this dead infant, is called a mes mitzvah, as she has no one to bury her. Even though she is from a harlot, lingering of the dead above ground is forbidden. Does anybody remember the big fuss that was made in Moses Mendelssohn's time about lingering, not burying a corpse immediately? And here, because of a question over who should pay the burial expenses of the dead infant, who no one is claiming, the infant is laying there for days. And
that's money.
I just, yes.
Dam Tor Cemetery, what's the significance?
Now, Dam Tor is a outlying area. I assume it's a kind of pauper's cemetery, because all these children are buried in, I gave you the Yiddish transcription here, Dammtor, I think is how it's spelled in German today. But here in the original, it's in 2 different words and so forth. So it would be not among the find people who have plots in the good cemetery. But this would be a plot that was acquired for purposes like these. I wanted you to notice a few other little things. On the bottom of page 40, one such Misharetet Zona, a harlot, said explicitly on the birthing stool, I'm reading the second line from the bottom, at the time of the birth, to the midwife. We all know about the role of midwives, both from the work of Elisheva, great classics like Laurel Ulrich's Midwife's Tale. Midwives served a purpose as agents of the community to take testimony. And it was believed that what a woman said while she was giving birth, the pangs of labor, would make the truth come out, and would name the true father. The fathers play very little role in most of these cases. In the year and a half that this Pinkas covers, there were 7 instances of children who had conflicts over their burial. We're not even talking about the ones that never make it into his Pinkas, because it was clear who was responsible and they took care of it, and that was the end of that. So in that year and a half, and I also gave you a statistic that he cites, that there were about 90 some odd births to the Jewish community in a year. So just to give us a sense of perspective. So out of these 7, only one of them was assigned, the expenses were assigned to somebody who was not related to the woman's side. All the others, if there was an adult male, like the girl's father, who could be located and identified and be made to pay the expenses, then that's who bore the burden of the burial. And if not, as we see a little bit later on, I will show you, I want to go in order. If not, the expenses are to be deducted from the wages of this servant girl. And if they don't have the money to cover that, they get written into the page of cherem. But I want to go in order because I wanted you to see what happened to the testimony that the midwife took. So during the birthing process, the woman names a man as the father of the child. And as a result, this man is ordered to go to the synagogue and take an oath saying that he wasn't, swearing that he wasn't the father of the child. That's it. End of the story. So much for the testimony. He is not made to pay the expenses of the child. He is not made in any other way culpable. Okay, enough said. Okay, on the other hand, because of their intimate relationship with the members of the household, remember that these maidservants do have a certain amount of agency and power. Okay, let's look at some examples. On page 41, and this has nothing to do with pregnancy. It has to do with a maidservant who was being disrespectful to her master, and the master takes her to the kahal and says, you know, I can't have this girl in my home anymore. She speaks to us in this arrogant manner. I warned her that she should not do this. We're reading in the 74a in the middle. From here on, she is obliged to behave civilly like the other maidservants. The above-mentioned maidservant replied in a loud voice that she intends still today to go to the non-Jewish authorities and reveal that her master, when it came time to assess him to pay taxes, he stole items from the house before the tax assessor came. So she is privy to certain goings-on in the house, and she's using this as a counter. This gives her certain power. She says, I know what you guys do, and if you do anything to me, I'm going to go to the authorities and tell them what you are doing. Okay. A very interesting entry, which I think also ultimately reveals the power of a maidservant. On page 87, page 42 in the source book, 87a in the original source, a fellow Shamash comes to our author, Reb Itzik Shamash, and says, I'm asking you to take a deposition, to write in your semi-official notebook certain testimony that I'm about to give you. My maidservant is about to leave our service, and I'm afraid that after she leaves the household, she might say things about us that are not true, particularly because my wife suspects she's pregnant. Okay? And the girl protests that she's not pregnant and that she's a kosher, good Jewish girl and that she had never any intention of doing the following. But here is a man, clearly a respected member of the community, who was afraid of being accused by his maidservant that he had used her improperly. So that's, again, something that it sometimes worked both ways. Now, who were the fathers? Who were the fathers? We don't know in most cases who the fathers were. But there are a list of usual suspects. And it isn't always the senior householder. It is more likely to be a son, an adolescent son of the senior householder, because his father is the owner of the household, who somehow, again, remember the ages of these people. Hormones are raging. People are living in tight quarters. These are teenagers after all. Things happen. Or men servants. Or increasingly, as the 18th century marches on, and here I don't have, again, any basis to say this except for what Steve Lowenstein later finds in the Berlin community, liaisons between Jews and Christians. It is not impossible. Probably not the most likely suspects. Okay, on page 43, I wanted you to see what happened in the cases where the girls were too poor to pay. They are written, let's look at the middle entry there, 100A, a question regarding a harlot who was a wet nurse, now serving as a wet nurse. So she's going from one position to the other. In the home of Chaim ben Zanvo Wiener, her illegitimate child died, and the sign among the three communities, apparently they took turns. Every month, a different community was responsible for those who had no place. And the harlot doesn't even own a rag. She has nothing, just what's on her body. And her master does not wish to stand as surety, as security for her, saying that he offered security for the expenses of the child. He had just paid 5 Reichstaler for her last Friday. She still owed it. Who will assure him that she will not flee from his house in the interim? In the interim, the child rests there. The obligation to provide burial is upon us. It is the opinion of the Parnas HaChodesh that we bury it in the Damtor cemetery, and the expenses come from the triple community. In return, the harlot will be written on the page of Cherem till she will be excommunicated, as if, she could get even lower in status than she was, until she pays these expenses. Now, the burial arrangement, this was agreed to by the Parnasim and Manhigim of Altona in accordance with the opinion of the Parnas HaChodesh. But to write the harlot onto the page of Cherem was not agreed to by them. Why? Because the infant she was nursing had no mother. And they were afraid that if the woman was put into Cherem, the master would feel obliged to fire her, and that would disrupt the feeding of his child. And so they objected to that. Okay, I just want to conclude by saying, again, I have very little hard data. I wish I had more to be able to say how often this occurred, whether it's on the rise as we go toward the end of the 18th and the early 19th century. Again, I used Steve Lowenstein's book, The Berlin Jewish Community, where he does have documentation, and although he's primarily interested in Jewish-Christian liaisons, he also documents illegitimate births among Jewish women, mostly among maidservants, and comes to the conclusion that they are on the rise. And his interpretation is there's some kind of crisis in the Jewish family. I don't know, again, whether what happens in Berlin is in any way applicable to what happens elsewhere. Nevertheless, I think I'll rest here and open the floor for a discussion.
I have a question on how far that use went. There are cases where, because I guess if she became pregnant, then they didn't have to pay for the dowry anymore, and they are not responsible for her or the child. So were there cases of where it was almost premeditated?
Without question, there are certain cases where it seems to be to the financial advantage of the householder to get rid of the maidservant, because the dowry, it was usually a lump sum payment, except for her clothing and food, which she obviously got along the way, which she got at the end of her term of service. On the other hand, we see from the same sources that really good domestic servants are not so easy to come by. And therefore, truly, and therefore sometimes people fought over a particular servant. Both of them laid a claim to her. She came from somewhere, and both. So we, again, it works both ways.
Rachel, the fact that you're using a Pinkas, and it's easy to joke about it or to condemn it, the kind of they seem to be concerned about formalities, like the business about how you take an oath, and the fact that despite the swearing, the woman's testimony, all he has to do is show up and take an oath and so on, and you kind of made fun of that. But they are concerned about legalities, right? And bear with me a second. And this is a record kept by a communal authority who is clearly, his function and his concern is whose pocket is this burial going to come out of, this kind of thing. So there's a kind of premeditated genre here. There's a language, a lingo that they're going to use, and it comes up with the use of the term zona, right? They're using this word as an alternative to the tula, which they say if she's this, she can't be that, instead of some more neutral term. But to what extent? I mean, you already said you don't have a lot of evidence, whether it's on the right or something. But to what extent would you be willing, having worked through this material, to say, well, this is the construction of a community official whose concerns, insofar as he's keeping the book, is primarily about who pays and what the legal requirements are for who pays.
Well, there's no question that is his primary concern. That's not my primary concern.
Well, so would you be content then to drop out of this framework, and instead of talking about the taking advantage of the maid servants, escaping from having to pay them, and things like that, to talk about this as the kind of premarital sex that in fact is going on in this community? Now, the people who we hear about in the discuss are the maid servants, because they're the ones who become financial burdens. But why not say that in fact this is the kind of thing that's going on in the community generally? In other words, I'm not asking you to tell me about what you don't have any evidence for, but I'm asking you, do we have to accept this construction, which I think you did?
I think there's a lot of class. There is class consciousness here, and there is a sense that these. Again, this is not to say that girls from upper classes don't get into trouble. Of course they do. And maybe they have recourse to ways of dealing with it that maidservants didn't have. I don't know, and certainly not on the basis of this. I do think that there are other maidservants in Altona getting pregnant and having babies, and there's no consequence that shows up in this source, because he's only concerned where it was contested, and therefore it comes to the public in this forum. I think this is something that belongs to the question of the place of domestic servant girls within a household in early modern Europe. This is, by the way, far from unusual or unique to the Jewish community. This is completely common all over Europe, and not treated with nearly as much disdain. Illegitimacy is not, it's just part of the way things work in many other...
Can I just add one little comment to this? I had a graduate student once did a doctorate with me working on church and royal court records about women who were demanding men who had deflowered them to marry them. And the records used very clear language, which you could argue about what was really going on, but it was about financial obligations and power, and who was the servant girl and who was very often the owner of the house, and so on and so on. But when he actually did the research, this was in northern Spain, he discovered that in fact there was a whole level of sexual activity, a whole level of romantic engagement that was going on generally in the society, that in fact the supervision of daily life among young adults was far less rigid than the language of the courts suggested. So, just as a footnote.
Marriage is very rarely an acceptable solution here. There isn't even a suggestion, a hint, that what anybody wants here is to force a guy to marry the girl. And again, that's why I think there's a strong class basis, at least here. It's unthinkable that you're going to get somebody to be forced into a marriage. The most you could do is force them to pay the expenses that are incurred.
Are there similar entries for legitimate children that are fatherless? That is, a widow and then the child dies and she's poor? And
no, because it's clear where if somebody has a status in the community, even if they're poor, the community takes care of them in the way that had always been agreed upon. So it doesn't come up in this way.
I think she's actually...
Since I happen to be interested in children, first of all, I assume we're talking about infants, right?
Yes, I believe it.
So, do we know or run into the children who survived in some?
Yes, I found some of the children who survived in Pinkas Mohalim, in the circumciser's book, where I found, for example, in one Pinkas Mohel, the entries for most boys who are circumcised, they are the children of their fathers. The only time they are listed as the children of their mothers is when the mothers are not married. And one particular Mohel would write, Nolad le hapsula, which is a play on words, on the word virgin, meaning, a woman who was damaged goods.
At an older age?
That's a good question.
The text suggested here, I think, on 5a, at the very beginning, he says, as we use our merciful, we have no choice to pay the expense to the child every quarter of the year. So, he's a financial, right?
In fact, these children, again, in Lowenstein's Berlin Jewish community, their schooling was paid for by the community. This is what the Talmud Torah was for the children of the poor, and again, we presume children like this. What could they look forward to when they grew up, maybe to become domestic servants and repeat the cycle. I don't know. Yes.
What, in connection with this, were there provisions for children who are both fatherless and motherless, namely truly orphaned?
There are, but orphaned
we
children
have,
belong to recognized families, and they are taken care of. This is, in a standard way. Every community has provisions for the poor and the orphaned. These are particular orphans in that they fall between the cracks because they don't belong to anybody, and they don't necessarily cannot easily be assigned to a particular communal charity fund.
right, I understand that, but that's what I'm interested in. These other institutions, orphanages, something akin to orphanages, or structures for adoption. When we know about that?
I don't know about formal orphanages. Remember, the communities are not very large, but relatives would adopt children of deceased relatives. There are means and ways, and again, it's not something I can speak with authority about. So
thinking about sort of ways of framing, we're now sort of talking about framing it in terms of what's going on with the children, but it strikes me, and this is, considering the early modern period, this is late for the early modern period,
yes.
So we're sort of late in the 18th century, that in fact, Renata Durr's book, I don't know if you've read that, which is called Make It Into Shot, I think, or something like that, isn't it called? The one that is Renata Durr, who does it, was the book on maids and the sort of changing, do you know what I mean, Claudia? Okay. It's at any rate, it's about sort of the changing discourse about domestic servants from in the 17th and 18th. Am I missing?
Maid in der Stadt.
Yeah. Maid in der Stadt. It's South Germany, but it's still. But the sort of changing discourse in the 18th century about really a much more hostile, by the end of the 18th century, by the middle of the 18th century, a much more hostile discourse toward domestic servants in general than had been the case in the 16th and in the 17th centuries, and that they were really seen as kind of interior infiltrators who bring terrible things into your household, and they're really seen no longer kind of in the 16th century. They're often sort of seen as kind of pathetic. It's unfortunate when these things happen, when they get pregnant or other things happen to them, but by the 18th century, they're much more, particularly female domestic servants, are seen as kind of, sort of lustful temptresses who tempt the young man of the household in order to try to maybe get him to marry her. So there's a much greater negative view of domestic servants by the 18th century than there was in the 16th century, which may, would be interesting to see how the language would be in similar kinds of sources in the 16th century, if it would be a bit more bland, or just not quite as moralizing as.
Well, again, I think the question is whether the problem is a rising one or whether there's always been a similar level. And my guess would be that in the 18th century it's more prevalent, but without hard evidence, I can't speak.
Three short things. First of all, he didn't mention Azrael Shoha, but he, in his book, also discusses this problem on, if I remember rightly, on the basis of other sources from Hamburg, the Krazot of the community or some such. I can't remember offhand.
Of Jewish maidservants? Or Christian?
He calls it Prisat Geder HaTzniut in his inimitable style, which means breaking down the borders of modesty. But it's about this. And he has other sources, also rabbinic sources, which would add, I'm sure, to what you're working on. The question of the word zonah is, there's one tshuva of the Noda B'Yehuda which talks about, it's been quoted a number of times, it talks about a young man who travels around in Lorraine, he's engaged to a girl, and then they have sex and she gets pregnant. And then the question is she pregnant from him or not? And it's interesting that the word zonah appears there only when it's the question of whether or not she's had sex with somebody else. At that time when they love each other and they say it couldn't possibly be anyone else and it was just him and me, even though they haven't got the dates right, they haven't sat together and worked out exactly when it happened. But and the word zonah has to do with illicit sex. But the fact that in this context the sexual intercourse between an engaged couple before their marriage isn't illicit sex is also very interesting. And I'm sure there's a lot of work to be done. It's a very interesting concept because you can get into some kind of the mentality of the period. And the last question is, most of your texts are about children who died. So are we talking about infanticide? Are these maidservants who are sort of trying to save themselves by getting rid of their kids?
Again, would never rule it out. But given the poverty that's just, we're talking about such desperate circumstances, it could either be starvation on purpose, not on purpose, I don't, again, without having, and many of them do grow up. Now also there's a high, rate of infant mortality, even without any of this. So it's, again, I can't speculate without evidence. All of these questions are valid questions, but I don't have the answers at my fingertips, and I don't want to.
The other thing is, if it was infanticide, then you have a question of the involvement of non-Jewish authorities, because you have a crime occurring. So is the Jewish community here in some ways trying to provide for the burial, so there is no charge of infanticide? And I don't know about Germany, but I know that in early modern Poland, if an infant was found, even if it was an accident birth, it was assumed it was an infanticide by default, unless they could come up with a good explanation why the child was dead. So I don't know, Elisheva, would you say something?
Here it's simply not raised as an issue, and again, some of these children do live to grow up, so they're not.
Yeah, I think that perhaps we're trying to put everything into one mold a little bit. Let's look at the source. They remind me very much of notarial texts that I know. And in some ways, at least one of the texts where they're taking evidence, it is indeed a notarial document. The prime notarial function is to take testimony. And I think that every case has to be looked at differently, because it's all sort of accidental how it falls in here. And it's also accidental as to how much of the case you know. Did the thing really stop with this man taking the oath, or did it not get in? I have some amazing texts, and I wish there was second, third, and fourth texts. It's very rare you can see the thing all the way from start to finish. Something is always missing. You have to be careful. We don't even know, for instance, this child who died, how old the child was. But also, in terms of this term of zonah. Now, I think the first thing that strikes me, I'm surprised no one's yelled, this is stigmatization of women. So I suggested promiscuous, but in fact, it could have been a woman, a servant, who was put upon by the master very, very easily. And that's one case. On the other hand, this woman who gave the child to non-Jews, it reminds me of an inquisitional trial, which my student Kathy Beller wrote a whole chapter on, in which a woman was sort of a half prostitute, half not prostitute, in the true sense of the term, and she gives or sells her child to non-Jews. The case is almost identical. So maybe this is a real case of prostitution or semi-prostitution, as opposed to others where they're just using the term for a poor woman who's been put upon by a master. And then finally, and I'll shut up, the question of menekot, of the wet nurse. Here they're taking these women as wet nurses. Why? Because you can't find a Jewish wet nurse otherwise? It could be, and so they'll take anybody, or after all, how do you get to be a wet nurse? By having a child in the first place. So, there are so many problems here and so many different ways to go at it that my just thought is you have to be very careful about generalizing.
There's a lot here about burial expenses. What do we know about burial expenses? What did they involve? Were they particularly heavy?
Yes.
Did people abandon their...
As difficult as it was to live as a Jew, it was very expensive to die as a Jew. Seriously. The right to a burial plot is something that comes up over and over and over again with the founding of new kehilot throughout the early modern period. Is not something that Jews can take for granted. God forbid you should die far away from your home. your family had to pay for transportation, which was also very expensive because every one of the many different states in Germany required, and if they let you through, you had to pay a huge toll because you couldn't just be buried in somebody else's Jewish community. So it's not to be taken lightly at all. The acquisition of land was expensive. It had to be in a place where it wasn't offensive to the Christian community. And in some places, Jews paid a death tax for every buried person, which might have been the case here. So the answer is, clearly, if we were talking about pittances, there would not be such a great dispute about whose turn it was to be responsible for these children.
Can you imagine the plight of the Jerusalem community with so many people coming to die there?
Yes. Nothing's changed.
Nothing's changed.
I can't keep track of whether some of these cases that are the same or not, but I think there were at least 2 instances here where a child was left with non-Jews, neighbors, someone the servant knew.
It's that one case which is one of the few that continues in different entries, and it was the woman who placed her child with a non-Jewish wet nurse while she ran away or had to escape for whatever reason. So this is not infanticide. She wants the child to live. She wants the child to be cared for, and the community picks up the expenses and pays this wet nurse, this Christian nurse, to feed the child. So there is a responsibility, and there is a sense that the child has a place, deserves compassion, deserves, to be raised.
Is it your instinct that the community would, in doing the right thing and paying for the expenses, then is not going to try to claim the child back in the community at some point?
Yes, a wet nursing situation doesn't mean that she gave up her child religiously.
But there would be no parent now.
No, but the father was Christian.
So, I'm just wondering, the child's 27 or so, is the child gone and they're paying the expenses and the child is accepted, it would be raised as a Gentile?
It probably depended on who was the father, what were the circumstances, and so forth. But you couldn't assume that the children were written off.
Servants are, by their nature, poor people, men and women, but there seems to be, in normal situations, a sort of balance between householders and servants. On the one hand, they need work, they need support, they need food, but a good house needs discreet servants, professional, loyal. So there must be a sort of a balance between the two parties. And at least in Catholic context of 17th century, there are a lot of books describing how to run a house, economica books, which devote a lot of space to servants. What is a good servant? And female or male servant. And a lot of them speak about, for example, the education, the religious education or the religious responsibility by the masters towards their servants. Now, what we have here, at least this is my impression, and I would like to hear your comment about this, that this balance actually disappeared. It broke away. And the householders, be they men or women, have all the power, and the servants none. And and it runs like in every aspect of these documents. It begins with the word zonah, which is very delicate in the sense that it appears also in medieval texts, this word zonah. But once you become a zonah, once you become a prostitute, a harlot, promiscuous, there's no way back.
No,
it's only...
See, that's where I disagree, because the very first entry is a ketubah, a marriage contract.
Yes.
So there is life.
But it's a ketubah v'zonah. She continues to be a harlot, even being married. Or there's another story about a man who married twice a woman. Yeah.
Right.
But they are defined or tagged as prostitute, even being married or not or having children. They can't fight the fama, the public fame against them. The master can yell at them and
Scarlet letter.
Yeah.
and actually they're they don't have at their disposal any institutional mode that can provide them protection. In this sense, there's a very disowning or disclaiming of the status of servants in the Jewish society of this particular community, which means, as I see it again, I would like to hear your opinion. First, or not maybe first sign, but sure signs of bourgeoisement of the Jewish family.
Well, let me try and answer, because I think we're running out of time. We didn't mention one figure in all of this because she is absent in the source. What about the mistress of the house? Now, in earlier Jewish guidebooks, and there are for how to run a household, it's the mistress of the house who's supposed to take this teenage girl under her wing and try to educate her into responsible adulthood. So that's really the foil. You know, this woman has to watch that her servants behave and that her husbands behave. And I'd like to conclude with a little joke that I read in a contemporary German source in which the wife comes to the husband, the mistress of the house comes to the master of the house and says, you know, I think our servant girl is pregnant. The master of the house says, that's her business. The mistress says, yeah, but I think she's pregnant by you. He says, well, that's my business. And then she says, well, in that case, I think I'm going to fire her. And he says, well, that's your business. So there is another persona in the household that has been absent from this. What happened to the mistresses of the house? They're really
of the text.
I understand. In the testimony, in the notarial testimony where she appears.
But that testimony also tells us a lot about what these women are saying about themselves.
Yeah, but I'm just introducing that as a potential additional counterweight. It's not just a free-for-all between masters and servants. There's a household, there's a family, there's somebody who's responsible supposedly for the moral welfare of these girls.
Thank you very much.